My boyfriend and his family mocked my late father during the engagement party, so I called off the relationship right then and there without hesitation. I, 24F, never thought I'd be writing this, but here I am at 2 a.m., still shaking from what happened tonight. My engagement party turned into the worst night of my life, and I need to get this out before I lose my mind. My father died when I was 16. Cancer took him slowly, and those final months watching him waste away broke something in me that never fully healed. He was a mechanic, worked with his hands his whole life, and never made much money. But he was the kindest man I ever knew. He taught me to change oil, fix a flat tire, and most importantly, to never let anyone make me feel small because of where I came from. I met my now ex-boyfriend 2 years ago at a coffee shop near the university where I was finishing my nursing degree. He was charming, well-dressed, and seemed genuinely interested in my stories about growing up in a working-class neighborhood. His family owned a chain of upscale restaurants, and he'd grown up with privileges I could only dream of. But he never made me feel less than, or so I thought. The engagement happened 3 months ago. Nothing fancy, just him proposing during a quiet dinner at home. I said yes because I loved him, and because I thought he understood me. His mother immediately took over planning the engagement party, insisting it be held at their country club. I felt uncomfortable with the venue, but I figured it was important to her, and I wanted to start our marriage on the right foot. Tonight was supposed to be our celebration. I'd bought a dress I couldn't really afford, spent hours getting ready, and even practiced small talk topics that might impress his family's friends. I arrived at the country club feeling nervous, but hopeful. The place was decorated beautifully, with white roses and string lights that made everything look like a fairy tale. For the first hour, everything seemed perfect. His family was polite, his friends were friendly enough, and I started to relax. I even began to think I'd been overthinking all my anxieties about fitting into his world. Then his uncle started drinking heavily. I was standing near the bar, talking to one of the other guests about my nursing program, when I overheard his uncle talking loudly to a group of men. He was telling some story about blue-collar workers, using the kind of language that made my stomach turn. I tried to ignore it, but then I heard him mention mechanics specifically. His uncle was going on about how people who work with their hands are too stupid for real jobs, how they're just glorified grease monkeys who never had the brains for anything better. The group was laughing, and I felt my face burning with embarrassment and anger. But I told myself to stay calm, that he didn't know about my father. Then my boyfriend joined the group. Instead of changing the subject or walking away, he started adding to the conversation. He told them about how his car had broken down last month, and how the mechanic who fixed it was clearly trying to scam him because these people always assume rich folks don't know anything about cars. The group laughed harder, but it got worse. His cousin chimed in with a story about her father-in-law, who'd been a factory worker before he died. She talked about how embarrassing it was at the funeral, seeing all these rough-looking people in cheap suits, acting like they belonged in the same room as decent society. She said it with such disgust, like these people were somehow contaminated. I felt sick, but I kept telling myself they didn't know. They didn't know my father had been a mechanic. They didn't know I'd grown up in that world they were mocking. They didn't know I'd worn a thrift store dress to his funeral because it was all we could afford. Then his mother joined the conversation. She started talking about how grateful she was that her son had found someone who was trying to better herself, someone who was working hard to escape her background. She said it like she was being generous, like she was doing charity work by accepting me into their family. But the worst part was what came next. His uncle asked what my father had done for work, and before I could even process what was happening, my boyfriend answered for me. He told them my father had been a mechanic, but then he added something that made my blood freeze. He said he was glad my father had died before he could embarrass me at the wedding. The group erupted in laughter. His mother made some comment about how at least they wouldn't have to worry about having some grease-stained man walking me down the aisle. His cousin added that it was probably for the best, since people like that never know how to act at nice events anyway. I stood there for what felt like hours but was probably only seconds, watching the man I thought I loved laugh along with his family as they mocked my dead father. The man who'd raised me alone after my mother left. The man who'd worked double shifts to pay for my school clothes. The man who'd died worrying about whether I'd be okay without him. Something inside me snapped. I walked over to their little circle, and the conversation died as they noticed me approaching. My boyfriend's face went pale as he realized I'd heard everything. His mother tried to smile and change the subject, asking if I was enjoying the party. I told them exactly what I thought of their conversation. I told them my father had been worth more than all of them combined. I told them he'd taught me more about decency and kindness in 16 years than they'd learned in their entire privileged lives. I told them their money couldn't buy them class, and their behavior tonight had proven that. His mother tried to backtrack, saying they hadn't meant anything by it, that it was just harmless conversation. His uncle mumbled something about not knowing I was listening, but my boyfriend just stood there, looking embarrassed that I was making a scene. That's when I knew it was over. I pulled off my engagement ring and set it on the bar. I told him the engagement was off, that I wouldn't marry someone who could laugh about my father's death, someone who was ashamed of where I came from. I told him I deserved better than a family who saw me as a charity case they were graciously allowing into their world. The entire party had gone quiet by this point. Everyone was staring, and I could feel their judgment and shock. But for the first time all night, I didn't care what they thought of me. I walked out of that country club with my head held high, even though I was crying. I drove home in the dress I couldn't afford, to the small apartment I'd been planning to give up when we got married, and I've been sitting here ever since trying to process what happened. My phone has been buzzing nonstop. He's been calling and texting, saying his family didn't mean it, that they were just drunk and talking nonsense. He says he loves me and wants to work things out. His mother even called to apologize, though she spent most of the conversation explaining how I'd misunderstood their intentions. But I keep thinking about the look on his face when he said he was glad my father was dead. The casual cruelty of it. The way he laughed along with people who were mocking the most important person in my life. Update 1. It's been 3 days since the engagement party, and things have gotten complicated in ways I never expected. Yesterday morning, I got a call from my best friend who works at the local newspaper. She'd heard about what happened at the country club through mutual connections, and she wanted to give me a heads up about something. Apparently, his family had been calling around, trying to control the narrative about why our engagement ended. They were telling people I'd had some kind of breakdown at the party, that I'd gotten hysterical over nothing and embarrassed everyone. That made me angrier than anything they'd said about my father. I decided I wasn't going to let them rewrite history. I started making some calls of my own. I reached out to other people who'd been at the party, people who'd witnessed the whole thing. Most of them were uncomfortable talking about it, but a few were willing to confirm what had really happened. Then I remembered something my father had taught me about fighting back when people try to make you small. He'd always said the best revenge against people who think they're better than you is to prove them wrong by succeeding despite them. So I got creative. I knew his family's restaurant chain prided itself on community involvement and supporting local causes. They had a whole marketing campaign about being family-friendly and giving back to working-class communities. The irony wasn't lost on me. I started documenting everything. I wrote down exactly what had been said at the party, who had said it, and who had witnessed it. I gathered photos from the event that showed his family and their friends laughing during the conversation about my father. I even managed to get a recording from someone who'd been filming the party on their phone and had accidentally caught part of the conversation. Then I did something that felt both terrifying and empowering. I created a social media post telling my story. Not a rant or an emotional outburst, but a clear, factual account of what had happened. I included photos of my father in his work uniform, proud and smiling after fixing someone's car. I wrote about the kind of man he'd been, how he'd raised me to value character over wealth, and how he'd died worrying about my future. Then I contrasted that with what his family had said about people like my father. I included screenshots of their restaurant chain's website, with all their claims about supporting working families and being pillars of the community. The post went viral within hours. People started sharing their own stories about being looked down on for their backgrounds. Local mechanics and other blue-collar workers began posting about times they'd been treated poorly by wealthy customers. The restaurant chain's social media pages were flooded with comments from people saying they'd never eat there again. But the real surprise came yesterday evening. I got a call from a lawyer who'd seen my post. She told me she'd been following the story and wanted to offer her services pro bono. Apparently, she'd grown up in a similar situation, and my story had resonated with her. She said while I probably didn't have grounds for a lawsuit, there might be other ways to hold them accountable. She'd done some research into the restaurant chain's business practices and found some interesting information. Turns out they'd been claiming tax breaks for charitable donations to organizations that support working-class families, while simultaneously lobbying against minimum wage increases and worker protection laws. The hypocrisy was staggering. My ex-boyfriend showed up at my apartment last night, looking desperate and angry. He demanded I take down the social media post, saying I was ruining his family's business over a misunderstanding. He tried to convince me that his uncle and cousin had been the real problem, that he'd just been trying to fit in with them. I told him I'd heard him laugh when his mother said she was glad my father was dead. I asked him to explain how that was just trying to fit in. He couldn't answer. He left after threatening to sue me for defamation, but his threat felt empty. Everything I'd posted was true, and I had witnesses to back it up. Update 2. A week has passed, and the fallout has been more intense than I ever imagined. The story got picked up by local news outlets, and suddenly I was being asked to do interviews about classism and how working-class families are treated by wealthy society. I was nervous about the attention, but I kept thinking about my father and how he'd want me to stand up for people like him. The restaurant chain's stock price dropped significantly. They released a public statement saying the comments made at the private party didn't reflect their company values, but the damage was already done. Several of their corporate sponsors pulled out, and at least 3 locations had to close temporarily due to protests. His family hired a crisis management firm to try to control the narrative, but it was too late. Too many people had witnessed what happened, and too many others had their own stories about being treated poorly by wealthy families who looked down on working people. The most satisfying part came when I received a call from the local mechanics union. They wanted to offer me a scholarship in my father's memory to help other children of blue-collar workers pursue higher education. They said my story had inspired them to create a fund that would ensure kids like me wouldn't have to choose between honoring their backgrounds and pursuing their dreams. But the real vindication came from an unexpected source. One of the guests from the engagement party reached out to me privately. She was the wife of one of his business partners, and she told me she'd been disgusted by what she'd witnessed that night. She said she'd been looking for a way to speak up without damaging her husband's business relationship. She gave me information about other incidents where his family had shown their true colors. Stories about how they treated their restaurant employees, how they talked about their customers behind closed doors, how they'd used their wealth and connections to avoid consequences for their behavior. Armed with this new information, the lawyer who'd offered to help me was able to build a case for a pattern of discriminatory behavior. While we couldn't sue them for what they'd said about my father, we could expose their business practices and hold them accountable in other ways. The state labor department launched an investigation into their restaurant's treatment of workers. Several former employees came forward with stories about wage theft, unsafe working conditions, and verbal abuse from management. The family that had mocked my father for being a blue-collar worker was now facing serious consequences for how they'd treated their own blue-collar employees. My ex-boyfriend made one final attempt to contact me, this time through his lawyer. They offered me money to sign a non-disclosure agreement and stop talking about what had happened. The amount was substantial, enough to pay off my student loans and give me a comfortable start in life. I turned it down without hesitation. Some things are more important than money, and my father's memory was one of them. Update 3. It's been a month since the engagement party that changed everything, and I'm writing this final update from a very different place than where I started. The restaurant chain ended up filing for bankruptcy. The combination of lost customers, legal fees, and the Labor Department investigation was too much for them to handle. His family lost most of their wealth, and several family members, including my ex-boyfriend, had to find regular jobs for the first time in their lives. I heard through mutual acquaintances that he's now working as a junior accountant at a small firm, making less in a year than his family used to spend on vacation. His mother had to sell their country club membership and move to a modest house in a middle-class neighborhood. The irony of their situation wasn't lost on anyone who knew the story. But the most meaningful outcome was the scholarship fund that grew out of this whole experience. What started as a small gesture from the Mechanics Union became a major initiative supported by dozens of local businesses and organizations. We've already awarded scholarships to 15 students whose parents work in blue-collar jobs, helping them pursue everything from nursing to engineering to teaching. I finished my nursing degree and got a job at the hospital where my father had been treated during his final months. Every day, I work with families going through what we went through, and I try to give them the kind of compassionate care that my father deserved. The attention from the story also led to unexpected opportunities. I was invited to speak at several events about class discrimination and the value of blue-collar work. I've been able to share my father's story with hundreds of people, ensuring that his memory lives on in a way that honors who he really was. A few weeks ago, I received a letter from a young woman whose father was a construction worker. She'd seen my story and wanted to thank me for helping her feel proud of her background instead of ashamed of it. She was starting college in the fall and said my story had given her the courage to be honest about where she came from instead of trying to hide it. That letter meant more to me than any revenge I could have taken on my ex-boyfriend's family. I also met someone new. He's a teacher at the local high school, and his father was a firefighter who died in the line of duty when he was young. We understand each other in ways that my ex-boyfriend never could have understood me. He's proud of where he comes from, and he makes me proud of where I come from too. Looking back, I realized that the worst night of my life became the catalyst for the best changes I could have imagined. My father always told me that good things come to people who stand up for what's right, even when it's hard. I never understood what he meant until now. The engagement party where his family mocked my father's memory ended up being the beginning of a movement that honored everything my father had stood for. Working people deserve respect. Everyone deserves dignity. And sometimes the best way to honor someone's memory is to make sure their values live on through your actions. I still miss my father every day, but now I carry his memory with pride instead of pain. And I know that wherever he is, he's proud of the woman he raised and the stand she took when it mattered most. The ring I left on that country club bar was supposed to represent my future, but walking away from it gave me a future I never could have imagined. Sometimes the best revenge isn't getting even. It's becoming everything the people who hurt you never thought you could be.